In a world of misinformation regarding this Brandon Aiyuk trade saga, one thing has been abundantly clear. There's a handful of people that when they report, they are only reporting from a credible place where they have backed and substantiated information, which is why they're sharing it. Otherwise, they will either clearly discern if they are kind of presenting hypotheticals or discussing it in a way of how they're interpreting it. So that's why guys like Mike Garafolo, when they go on the Rich Eisen show and present this information, it sounds like the most credible update that we currently have regarding the holdup with Brandon Aiyuk, the trade, and why it hasn't gone through yet, and what the 49ers could be potentially trying to do prior to saying yes to a Brandon Aiyuk trade. So this is definitely an update worth listening to, and I definitely have some thoughts on it as well. So take a listen as Garafolo, NFL Insider, joins Rich Eisen to share the latest information about the Brandon Aiyuk trade saga and why it hasn't been completed just yet.
Mike.
In my estimation, and this is all educated, I would say more educated than guessing, but I would call it an educated guess because you got to piece this thing together.
Sure.
The 49ers, because we said they're never going to trade Brandon Aiyuk because they're trying to win the Super Bowl. Well, at some point, this thing turned to the point where they were open to it because they had shut it down going back to the spring and just recently had really engaged with teams and given Aiyuk and his agent permission to speak to teams because they got to get the contract part of it done. So they, I don't know exactly when, but within the last week or so, opened the gates to that. But just like we said, they're trying to win the Super Bowl. They're trying to figure out, okay, well, how do we make sure we get a wide receiver back? Which is why the reports came out, the framework of a deal with the Patriots and the Browns. They have receivers that coming back would make sense to the 49ers. The Steelers don't have that. They're not going to trade George Pickens, obviously. And that's why they need Aiyuk and why they have interest in Aiyuk. So part of this, and they just signed Robbie Chosen Anderson. I think he's got all three names now, if I'm not mistaken. So is that enough in their mind to say, okay, well, now let's work out the best deal we possibly can with the Steelers? Or is that just part of the process and they're still going to go? Like, this is all, okay, we got to figure out this trade, but we also have to figure out we're creating a hole. So how do we best plug that hole as well? So there's a lot of things going on at once. And that's why I believe it's kind of been stuck in the mud a little bit the last couple of days.
Well, the Chosen Anderson signing to me sounds like they need to get somebody in camp, you know, and I'm sure Anderson's going to take an opportunity to get off the couch and play in a preseason game and maybe put some tape out there for himself. I can't imagine they're going to take somebody off the, you know, at the crib and say that's Aiyuk's replacement. Clearly, they did also get, Pearsall in the draft. And so I totally understand that they'd want a wide receiver back. But what happened? Have you determined what you're reporting on why the Niners suddenly said, okay, we'll take a look at trading him at the top of training camp when you're so close to a season? Like what happened? Do you know?
I would say the hold-in worked, and because he was there and he was participating in meetings and he was around the facility, and from my understanding, he wasn't an issue inside the building. He just wasn't practicing. Now there have been some meetings and some conversations. Go back to that meeting that they had. It was in July. It was before training camp, and Aiyuk was the one that initiated it, and it was with the intention of trying to get things reset and from my understanding in that meeting, a lot of folks on both sides said some things they need to get off their chest. And they came away and it was like, okay, now we can potentially reset and negotiate a deal leading up to training camp so we don't have a holdout or a hold in or an issue or anything like that. Just get this deal done. And then it never really happened. They never got a formal offer from the 49ers. We have said repeatedly that the formal negotiations and the formal offers, and this is something where over the course of reporting on the NFL, I've kind of learned what constitutes an offer. Like, you can say in a conversation, okay, we'd be willing to do this, or an agent or a player doesn't really consider an offer to be an offer until it's sent in an email. And okay, we've got a chance, and we've got a paper trail basically. So they haven't done that for months. They haven't done that since back in the spring. So the hold in happens, and it was strategic. And you can see Kyle Shanahan day by day being asked about it, getting more and more impatient because he wants to go out and coach the best football team he possibly can. So I could tell that this is something that has been grinding on him and grinding on the team. And they got to the point where it's like, all right, it's not going to happen here. It doesn't seem that way. So let's see if we can just get him out of here and make him happy, and we move on.
So there are multiple things to kind of digest here from Mike Garafolo, who has absolutely been plugged in. He's been one of the absolute credible sources that we can rely on all these Brandon Ayuk updates. So considering that he's been vetted, and rightfully so, we can now take what he is saying and kind of expand on it a little bit further, because there's two things that he's really talking about. One thing he's talking about is saying why this trade hasn't gone through yet. And he's also talking about where this kind of went wrong. So let's kind of discuss where it went wrong. I think that meeting that he was referring to in July, if you don't remember, Brandon Ayuk was pulling up to the stadium. I think it was around 7 o'clock in the morning. I happened to be in Tennessee, so I was already on my phone. I saw Brandon Ayuk goes live. I pop in, and Brandon Ayuk is kind of charged up. I would say he had a aggressive demeanor while pulling up. You remember he's going really fast at the gate. He's saying, "Let me in." Like, he had kind of an aggressive demeanor. And so that's kind of what I believe Garofalo was talking about in that meeting. And he said, things were said, things were shared. So I don't know if that was a meeting that it sounds like Brandon Aiyuk scheduled because the 49ers hadn't presented any new deals to him, and maybe things went bad in that particular meet. I don't know. I'm speculating at this point. But then, as you heard from Garafolo, he said at some point around training camp, the 49ers decided that they were going to open up and give Brandon Aiyuk and his agent the opportunity to seek a trade. And this is a complete 180 of what the tone was about the situation earlier since the draft. The 49ers had been clear that they weren't going to trade Brandon Aiyuk. So something happened, something changed. We don't know exactly what it is, but I'm speculating that it could have been the public trade request, that maybe that was the final straw that broke the camel's back. And that's where the 49ers were like, all right, we are going to move on from this situation. And that's how they proceeded since then. Again, speculating. So, also on that, that's led us up to where we are now, where we're trying to figure out what's going on, what's happening, what's what. And as Garafolo basically explained, where the 49ers are currently stuck is if they trade Brandon Ayuk to the only place that Brandon Ayuk will go, which is the Steelers, they aren't getting a receiver in return. They might get a player, but they're not getting a receiver. And as I've discussed on my channels over the last couple days, is you are having to replace 75 receptions, nearly 1,400 receiving yards, and 7 touchdowns on top of an all-pro player who blocks his tail off. So I don't think you can do that with really the guys that you have on your roster. You're going to have to do it with a committee. You don't have one guy who's going to step into that role. Ricky Pearsall has been dealing with injuries. Juwan Jennings just isn't that style of wide receiver, although a quality one. Same thing you could say about Debo. And the 49ers go out and they sign Robbie Anderson. Still, it doesn't feel like that is enough to replace the production that you will vacate by trading Brandon Ayuk. So the way Garofalo's kind of explaining it is that the 49ers are looking for an option. They're looking for a wide receiver to come in and fill that hole. And one of the reasons why this trade hasn't gone through yet is because they haven't been able to locate that wide receiver replacement. So, what will that mean? Who will they turn to? Could there be a potential? It could be Cortland Sutton. Is it a potential that it could be Devontae Adams? Could you go out and maybe get T. Higgins, who had a situation with the Bengals as well? So what happens next? That's why I feel like this was the most accurate update we've gotten up until this point. He kind of details the timeline of kind of where things have gone wrong between this relationship, and then he discussed what the holdup is currently in regards to why a trade hasn't gone through, why we keep hearing the same regurgitated reports about the 49ers and the Steelers and blah, blah, blah. And it just keeps going back and forth, back and forth. But it sounds like the holdup is that the 49ers understand kind of what I've been saying for the last week or so is that if you trade Brandon Ayuk without getting a suitable replacement, whether in the form of a quality player, doesn't have to be a wide receiver or a just quality wide receiver, you automatically lose this trade. You aren't getting better. You are getting worse. And that is a hard pill to swallow if you're a fan because we all know what Brandon Ayuk brings to the table. We all understand that the 49ers are in a position to win a Super Bowl this year, and your best bet would be to have Brandon Ayuk on the field. So if you don't have Brandon Ayuk on the field and you don't get a starting caliber player in return, you're simply subtracting an all-pro player from your team and not adding any value in return. That's why to me, future picks aren't shouldn't be considered because that doesn't help you this year. And this is a huge year for the San Francisco 49ers. So it's definitely an ongoing situation. I definitely understand uh, and get it all. But I do believe that as it stands right now, that the 49ers are just looking for another wide receiver. And until that happens, they're not going to be trading Brandon Ayuk because it will be deemed a massive loss in regards to the trade. So that's my interpretation. I'm curious to see what your interpretation is of this situation. Let me know what you guys are thinking in the comments below. And as always, make sure to like and subscribe for more updates.